Hello, welcome to .NET Conf. My name is Chris Ayers, and today we're going to talk about .NET configuration in depth. Now, I'm a senior customer engineer at Microsoft. My day job is helping people do stuff with Azure. I'm just speaking here as myself. I'm on all the socials, I blog, and all of these samples and my dev containers for running everything are in GitHub under CodeBytes. So I want to start talking about what is configuration, how does Framework handle configuration, how does .NET and ASP handle it, what are configuration providers, bindings, options patterns. We got a lot of stuff. But starting out, like, what are settings? They might be values like retry times or queue length that we use to configure our application. They could be feature flags by user or percentage where we're rolling out features or we're enabling features for people. They could be secrets like connection strings or registrations that we want to keep safe. All of these are types of configuration. We're mainly going to focus on the first one, but we're going to touch on the other two. Now, historically, we might have applied a lot of our configuration at compile time, where we have a configuration we bake into the binary, and that's what we use for dev, or we build a test build or a prod build. A lot of times nowadays, we build one artifact. We build it one time, and we apply configuration at runtime. And that's where all of the new power of the configuration system comes from. Like, we get to be able to configure things dynamically, and at runtime, it's awesome. So when we talk about the .NET Framework configuration, 4, 4.7, 4.8, web config, and everything's a key value pair. They're strings. We access them to a configuration manager. Dependency injection isn't provided. There's this transformation syntax, but it's kind of difficult, very easy to mess up. We did have slow cheetah, which helped us, but it was very hard to unit test. It was easy to leak secrets. It kind of looked like this, and we would a lot of times wrap the configuration manager with an interface and a class so that we could dependency injection. And if we wanted to get a bool or an int or a date time out of these strings, we would just have to do a bool parse and hope it didn't blow up. And I'll show you that real quick. I've got a sample of framework. And so, our web config was, this XML. And we would have to set these values. And then we would have a debug or a prod release where we could use XDT to transform certain properties or to match. So if we had 5 different connection strings in our dev, we would want to match one based on the name, like MyDB, and then set the connection string attribute. It was a very interesting syntax. Now, with .NET Core 5, 6, 7, 8, it's been completely redone. There's the idea of configuration sources. So this might be a JSON file or an XML file. This might be an environment variable or command line argument or something custom that you've made, like tying it to a database. These are processed by configuration providers, and you define them in a certain order, like I want my JSON files first, then my environment variables. Those get processed by the builder, and you get a configuration out of it. So, for example, if I defined my environment as dev and my DB as localhost in my JSON file, but I had an environment variable that overrode DB, and then I had some command line argument I passed to change my log level, configuration builder flattens everything down in the order we defined it, and then it's going to give us that bottom little box that give us our full rendered configuration, dev, connection string, and info. And in addition to that, it does support nesting and hierarchies of values. So if we have a JSON object like logging log level default over here on the left, it gets rendered out as a single key separated, logging log level default. And so it can represent any level of structure. And we can take those keys and that configuration, we can bind them to classes. We don't have to worry about parsing things for ourselves. .NET and the configuration system will bind it to a class for us. And we're going to dive deep into this. So if I just go to a console and do .NET new, I get no configuration out of the box. If I do .NET new web app or something in ASP, I'm going to get JSON provider configured with app settings. I'm going to get environmental variables, command line arguments, user secrets. I'm going to get things. And there's so many different configuration providers. Besides JSON and XML, INI, we can have keys that are files, environment variables, and command line arguments. In memory is awesome for unit testing. User secrets so that we can protect our development secrets, and key vault and Azure App Config. And so given just a normal JSON file, we can add just a couple lines of code to reference that and add it to the configuration system. Same with XML. Same with environment variables. If we define these in our system, we can access them even with a custom prefix. And I'll talk about the double underscores here in a moment. We can pass command line maps so that we can have short names for some properties. And I'll show you that. And then we can give it a directory, and have it load each file as a configuration option itself. And then we can set up just a dictionary to hold our in-memory configuration. It's really powerful. So like I said, if I just do .NET new, I have no configuration. If I want to get some configuration with like JSON, for instance, I can add some packages under the Microsoft Extensions configuration namespace, the .json, and I can say, hey, Mr. Configuration, I would like a configuration builder, and I want you to add JSON, and I want this file I made up, config JSON. It could be app settings, it could be anything. I'm just making it config JSON. And it's just a simple file with a greeting and environment. And if I look at my program files, I'm accessing that configuration, and I'm just, give me the greeting, give me the environment. And so now, if I run it, it's going to spit out that configuration. And I can come in here and I can change this configuration, and I can run it again. And I've got a dynamic application. I can now customize it whenever I want. We can add multiple configuration providers, as we had in the example. So I can have that config that's still set to dev, but then I can say also look at environmental variables. So if I just do my normal .NET run, it's dev. But I can say for this command, it's QA, and I want to do a .NET run. And so I'm not even changing files anymore. I'm changing the environment, and it's responding. This is something we might use in a Docker file or in Kubernetes, and through containerization, where we're going to be a lot of times driving through environment variables. Maybe we want to do command line, and so I could easily set my helps if you're in the right folder. I could easily set what environment I want to be in via command line. I could also set what I wanted via the environment variables, because that's still listed. But remember, it's JSON first, then environment, then command line. So if I set something in environment and then I set something in command line, it's going to take those changes and set them down. If I set the same value in two different things, the one that I've defined at the bottom of my configuration list will be the one that wins. Now, I'm a big proponent of user secrets. I highly recommend that you use them. If you're not familiar with user secrets, there's a whole document in ASP Core about like safe storage of app secrets. There's a secret manager tool. It has all sorts of things about how to manage user secrets, both in Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. It's awesome. User secrets, when you set them up, they'll add some sort of GUID to your CS proj. All it is an identifier. It's not checked in, and nothing's going to be. I mean, this will be checked in your CS proj file, but no secrets will be checked in or anywhere in your file system of your Git repo. So when I set a user secret, I just say set, and I could set something like environment is going to be prod. And so it is said, oh, your environment is now prod. This is stored on your hard drive in like your local settings, like your app data, outside of your development environment. So you're not going to check in any secrets. But it lets you just access and override environments and configuration like you normally would. So if you needed to connect to something and in a testing non-prod environment, and you wanted to be able to debug something without having it in your file system where you might have saved it in a config file and checked it in, definitely go look at user secrets. Another thing we can do, and just to start making things a little bit more complex, since we've got the ideas of configuration, is let's set up some nesting, like a greeting with a message and a color. And so if I want to access these, I access these with that colon I talked about, greeting colon, color, greeting message. Now I'm using a cool package called Spectre Console, and I've added the command line argument still, just like before, but I can do a .NET run, and we've got a red hello world, and I can give it an argument, and notice I'm giving it the -- greeting colon color. So I can override those on command line, just like before. And I can access these nested properties very, very easily. But I don't like saying -- greeting color. What if I want to say color? I want to make it nice and easy and refined. Well, we can do that too. I mentioned earlier we have these mappings. So just like when you were accessing command line before, we're going to add a property called mappings. And this is just a dictionary of a short name and then the nested name. And so we can use this to quickly set nested properties without having to remember all of the values. So we can do it both ways, and both are valid. But we still read the value with that nesting. That doesn't change. But that's a really nice thing. We can also do key per file, where we're accessing a file with the key name, and then the contents is the thing. And if you want to do nesting with files, you have to use a double underscore. And we use a double underscore. We saw it in one of the screenshots earlier. When you can't use a colon, like on a file system or in a shell where it's a delimiter, maybe PowerShell or a memory object, you would use a double underscore. And that would be the same way. Another thing we can do is Key Vault. So Azure Key Vault has got some packages that they've added, and we can, get the URL of our Key Vault, get the base name of it, and we can say add Azure Key Vault and give it that URL. Now I've already logged into Azure. I've done an AZ CLI login, and so for me, it's using my default Azure credential, which is me logged in. If I was running this in Azure, I would use a managed identity or some sort of strict permission to limit things. But I can come up here and, with Key Vault, I can have secrets, and I can, have information about it. Hello from Key Vault, and I can mess with my message. And if I want to make a new version and say secret value, I create that. It's going to set that. And now when I run this, I should be getting a new message. Yeah, hi there. So this is accessing that secret information through Key Vault. Now I'm not going to get into all the identity pieces. There's a lot of identity stuff to properly connect to services, but it adds it to the configuration system just like before. We're accessing it the exact same way. So it's a very unified configuration management system. Now I've been doing a .NET New. But you can also, if you do a .NET New console, you could add the extensions for hosting and do a host create application builder, where you can run your console apps inside of something like that. And when you do that, you start getting access to all sorts of stuff that you might expect from a application, a web app. So we're getting access to our configuration. We're having a hosting thing so that we can monitor it. We're getting a dependency injection. So if we want to do like services and inject or use configuration, we're accessing these things just like we would, through those examples that we built out. But it's a little bit more than just a .NET New console. And now let's walk through a scenario real quick. Let's say we have a configuration for an application where we're going to make a PDF or a markdown generator. And, I'm just printing out PDF template output. I'm printing out values from this flat file. But what if I want to make it a little bit more reusable? I can make this hierarchy where, I notice I'm using the same properties over and over again. Like I have a PDF extension, an output directory and template, and a doc extension and output directory. Well, I can still access everything just like I did before. I don't have to really change my program, just change the keys I'm accessing. But this has still got a lot of reuse and a lot of copying. So I'm going to keep that same config file with the same sections. But now I'm going to do something else. I'm going to say options. Give me a section. I shouldn't name this option. I should probably just call this configuration really. But because if I put my mouse over the parameter for file options, you'll see what we get. It's an iConfiguration. So the whole time before we were dealing with an iConfiguration or an iConfiguration root, and we were getting the whole thing. Now we're saying, go look in your config and find a section called PDF and just give me that. Just give me that one section. And so instead of all those prints I was doing before, I'm now doing it by section. I'm starting to reuse my code, and I'm saying I want to config with an output directory and a template and an extension. I'm still dealing with strings. Everything's still a string. Everything's still from configuration. And we can take this a step further. We can go a little bit farther with that same configuration, and we can get a class. So we can say, I want to make a file options. And if we go down here, file options has those properties that I was talking about. I want to know that I'm getting those properties. And I updated my method to work on that class. So I'm working on those methods and those properties. And so now I can say, give me a section, and bind it to that class. So in this case, I have a class I've instantiated, and I'm going to bind that class to that section. So that's what bind does. If I don't already have a class, like an instance of a class, I can say get, and this is going to return a new file options that's been bound to doc. So it's going to do the bind for me. It's like get section, new, and bind, when I do that. And so, we can operate on classes now. We can start binding stuff to real classes. And we're going to take this a little farther in the next section. Let me go back here to the options pattern. This is where we're going to start really diving in. And we're going to not have those strong dependencies on configuration, hopefully. We can start pulling them apart and depend on our classes more. So that options class we were looking at, it needs to be non-abstract with a public parameterless constructor, and you have to have public rewrite properties. So just like with binding for a web API, we got to have the same type of properties. Now, when we use this iOptions pattern, we're going to have three choices. There's an iOptions, which is a singleton, and then it won't support reloading. And I'll show you that. Like if I change my configuration files or my Azure App Config or Key Vault while it's running, the iOptions won't reload and pick up the new value. It gets calculated right at startup, and it's just going to like stay there and not get updated. It also doesn't support things called named options, and I'll show you what those are momentarily. And then we have an iOption snapshot monitor. One of them is a singleton, one of them isn't. So one is a little bit more friendly for transient services and transient injection, but they both support reloading and named options. So let's just go play with those, and I'll show you what I'm talking about, because I know it can be a little bit confusing. So I'm just going to run this application, and we're going to dive in. So this was a .NET new web API, and so I added a method called providers, just so we could see like we're getting a bunch of stuff, including picking up ASP.NET Core and .NET and app settings and environment variables. We're getting a lot of this stuff out of the box, and you can always find this information if you're looking by doing a method called. Well, I just went through my config root and providers, and I asked for all of them by string. There is another thing I'll show you where you can do a dump. It's really interesting where you can get all of your configuration and like see where it's coming from. There it is. Get debug view. That will show you which providers are loading which values. So you can troubleshoot that. But I can inject directly an iConfiguration into my page, and I've got PDF and it's true, and I can inject an iOptions, and I can inject a snapshot. So I'm getting the same data in all of these things. And what that looks like is, if I injected my config, it's literally in my constructor. I'm saying I want an iConfiguration, and I'm doing the same thing we were doing in program. Get a section, I'm binding it to a part of my config and say, give me a class out of it. So I'm getting classes out of it and adding them in there. For iOptions, it's a little different. For iOptions, I'm using iOptions Markdown Converter. I'm using a class. And if I look at this, the Markdown Converter just matches the style of the configuration we were looking at, and the file options matches what we were looking at before. It's just in this section here. So I've got it in a section. And the way that file stuff works is I went configure type T, Markdown Converter, and I told it the section I wanted it to bind to. Essentially, I've registered this configuration class, this options class, with the dependency engine. And so when I ask for an iOptions or a snapshot or a Markdown or monitor of the Markdown Converter, it's going to go through the dependency injection engine and get me one. So if I look at snapshot, I asked for an iOptions snapshot, and it gave me one. If I asked for a monitor, iOptions monitor. Now, snapshot and monitor and options have one other difference. I'm accessing it .value. So the iOptions snapshot, I'm accessing it and I get .value. Monitor is different. Monitor is the thing .current value. So that's the one that's a little odd, and we'll play around with why that is. So remember, I went through all of these. They all show true. What I can actually do is I can go change my config while the app is running. I don't have to reload. The application has not reloaded. Nothing's happening. But I can come up here, F5 with my injected config. I have iConfig going right into the page. It picked up on that change. How about iOptions? Nope. It's still true because iOptions is a singleton that only gets calculated when the site or gets initialized. The other two have already updated to false. Now this one's still true, and I'll show you why. This is something I think people can easily get messed up with. I'm injecting a transient service. So this should be every single time I get a request, I should get a new service. But I made a dependency on an iOptions in here. So because I made a dependency on iOptions, what's happening is this is a singleton. It got created the very first time, and it's using the old dependency every time I send a request. So something to be aware of. So let me close all of these. And now let's circle back to those named properties. So the idea behind named properties is not hard. When you register with dependency injection, when you configure the same class, the same thing multiple times. So I configured it as a PDF. I configured it for the doc section. So I've registered file options 3 times for 3 different sections. And so when I try to access it, there really isn't a way with the other ones. This is still, I can still go to the configuration. I can still get an object however I want. But iOptions doesn't really, it just has .value. It just has value. What monitor and snapshot provide is a get method. So I can say, hey, I'm asking for a file options. There's actually a couple of them. Give me the PDF one and give me the doc one. So I can specify which named option I want to get and retrieve and operate on. So that's what named options are. They let us kind of pick which implementation of the thing we want. It's pretty neat. All right, just moving on real quick since we're running out of time. One thing I love doing is Azure App Config. I talked about things being dynamic, and so I've got this data coming from Azure App Config. Yeah, black screen and white. What if I'm doing web applications where I have containers or I have all sorts of servers and services that are running, and I can't go into each machine and change a file? I want to be able to use a service like Azure App Config where I can manage configuration or feature flags for multiple services in my entire application. So right now my background color, I don't like that. It's black on white. Let me flip it around. So I'm going to make my background white. I'm going to change my font color to black. And then I'm going to update the Sentinel here. And I'll explain what the Sentinel is for in a minute. So we've updated all of our services. We can come back here. And boom, it's updated with that new data I just set it to. So the way that works is with Azure App Config, you add the extensions and you get a connection string. You have a connection string to Azure App Config. So I'm going to take a connection string to App Config and I'm going to say, hey, configuration system, add Azure App Config as a config store and use this connection string and also refresh my values. But don't let's say I had 100 values. I don't want it monitoring all 100. That could be intensive after a while. So what I'm going to say is just watch one value called Sentinel. If that changes, refresh everything, but you can cache stuff for 5 seconds. That way you're not pinging constantly. You're just looking every once in a while and going to see if stuff's there. That's really it. I've got to configure just like before and a section, and I'm using test app settings. And I don't know if you were eagle-eyed when we were up here, all of these are test app settings. So it's pulling all of these into a class that's getting updated automatically when I update it in the cloud. I think that's awesome. It's really neat. And you access the values exactly the same way you access any other value. So I'm accessing it here in Razor pages. So it's slightly HTML, CSHTML, but I have a style tag and I'm setting my background style just with inline CSS or C#. And I have an H1 that's getting updated. And so when that changes and I refresh it, I'm getting the new values. And finally, I want to get to the last 2 issues, which are awesome and problematic for a lot of people. So I'm going to try running my application and let's see what we get. So this is printing out a webhook, a display name, and some retry information. What's interesting about this is, I have defined my configuration in my settings class. So I have a settings class and I'm using data annotations. So I can say my URL is required and I have a regex on my display name, and I have a range on my retry times. And there's been many times when I've spun up an application and it doesn't instantiate some properties or some settings until a web request comes in, and then it goes, oh, that's not set right, and then it blows up. Well, what we've been able to do is add data validations right onto our classes. So I don't have retry time set, and I have a really, I'm just gonna, it's not the event, and I actually want retry times to be 5. I really want it to go through. So I'm gonna rerun this, and it won't even let me start it. And I can like go through my logs up here and look. Retry times error must be between 0 and 3, and URL length is too short. So, as I'm working on applications, if I screw up my configuration, if I mess up setting the config for QA or for prod and I have bad values, this won't even let me start running. It's going to stop me and say, hey, you messed up. And the way I can do that, it's really nice. The way you do that is when you bind or you add your options and you bind your section. Notice I set some const strings for the section name in my settings. You can say .validate data annotations. This is a data annotations method. It's awesome. And then you can add additional validations that you want. So if you have some custom validations you want to add, you can add .validate to add some extra rules, like, oh, I need it to be HTTPS. And then you can say .validate on start. So when .NET starts up, it's going to run through all the validations before it does anything else. And it'll tell you if you screwed up and maybe you put the wrong URL in there that's HTTP instead of HTTPS. I just got to find it. It is a little wordy at times. That's part of the problem. Now, one of the big improvements in .NET 8 is when you're dealing with these validations here, some of these can be done at runtime with reflection. And so there's some new ways to do it at compile time, and it'll generate some of the code right then. So yeah, compile time. So it'll do source generation of a lot of those checks instead of the data annotation. So it happens much more efficiently. Another thing you can do is you can actually make an iValidate class. So if you had some really complex logic that you wanted to implement to validate your stuff, you can make this class, and then in addition to the annotations, you can add a singleton and like validate, or you don't need to do the singleton, but you would add the validate options and register it with the services, and then you could do validation on startup every time. And then the final thing I want to talk about is, well, maybe not final, mostly final, is what about if you still have people putting bad values in there. So they're still putting in HTTP, and you need it to always enforce HTTPS. Well, what if after we validated that the configuration is there and we've tested that it's mostly good, we can make fixes and we can update values after they've been loaded. So that's something that you can do with a post configure. So you can do a post configure, say, hey, once you've instantiated this thing and validated this thing, go ahead and say, hey, does it start with HTTPS? And if it doesn't, go ahead and make sure that it does. Go ahead and just update that property and replace the HTTP with HTTPS. You could do something else. You could validate values that you don't want getting out or that you need to add some additional configuration to, but you can configure things after they've been loaded. Now, all of these samples, all these things have been running. They're in .NET 8. And if you're, I'm on an RC because it wasn't out at the time of this recording, but I've got a dev container. So as I'm playing with different versions of .NET, I usually use the latest one, which was 7, and I'll have like my ports forwarded and all my extensions configured. I've got a .NET 8 one I set up with a Docker file that has all of that stuff that I'm running .NET 8 in. And I love running .NET in a container. It's phenomenal. Please, if you have time, go look at the documentation on .NET configuration. They go deeper into writing your own custom providers, and there's guidance on if you're a library author. But all of my samples are out on GitHub under CodeBytes.NET configuration. These slides are all out there. I'm on all of the socials, like I said. But take some time, please go download .NET 8. I think it's the best .NET so far. I am a huge fan, and I think you'll like it too. Thank you.